Well, good morning, micro fans, and everybody else out there on YouTube. If you have helminthic parasites, you should do a search on the web, and I'm sure you can find some kind of colon flush that'll help you out. Yes. Because we've been getting more comments lately about how there are various ways you can treat your herpes and depression. And I say go for it. All right, so last time we were covering the ideas of parasitism and the initial notion of a symbiotic relationship between two living organisms. We can have a mutualistic interaction in which they just get along, a commensal interaction, commensalism, in which one guy is getting benefit, but the other guy isn't being harmed. And then we have a parasitic relationship, in which the host is in fact being damaged. And the host-parasite relationship is something that, from an evolutionary perspective, is studied a lot. There is this idea that if you are a fan of your Alice in Wonderland, the Red Queen idea, and that the Red Queen apparently has said something about we run as fast as we can just to keep from going backwards or something like this. I'm not sure what she says. But the idea that host-parasite interactions are constantly evolving. And as the host develops some kind of response against the parasite, the parasite's job is to just go ahead and slightly change so it can match the host. And the parasite is constantly changing a little bit to be able to keep its hold, its ability to survive. The host is constantly evolving to try and defeat the parasite, and it is just this constant arms race between the immune system and the different parasites as they are maintaining their foothold. So we were talking about fungi and fungal parasites, and that's a lot more of there's often single-celled organisms, and so certainly when you're talking about ringworm and athlete's foot, the fungus is basically living off your dead skin, and rather than just being a pleasant guest, it starts to actually generate inflammation and stuff. But it is a guy kind of just living off the land, a little bit like having bacteria beginning to get a little bit too far ahead of where they should be and causing upper respiratory infection. This is going to be a different kind of story. We're going to have creatures that are taking up shop within your body. So, we've got then these two different classes of pathogens that are parasites. And it's hard to put them into a single sort of contextual notion like fungi. These are all eukaryotes. The protozoans are single-celled, and as we go through them, you'll recognize some of the protozoans that disease you've heard of. They're usually single-celled, but they can be multicellular, but they're not carrying a whole bunch of cells. They can be motile, move around. They will have flagella, cilia, little crawly pseudopods. Sometimes they don't move at all, though. There are some algae that are photoautotrophic. Then most of them are heterotrophic. They have a range of different cell walls. So this is not so much the kinds of things you're going to find within us, but just the class of animals that we would call protozoans, or the class of eukaryotes that we call protozoans. So some protists are actually very deadly, and here's a couple that you've heard of. Malaria is a protozoan that in the organism that causes trypanosomiasis, trypanosomes. These are protozoans. Another kind of parasite that we would be, remiss in not mentioning are the class of organisms known as helminths. These are worms, and they are multicellular. They actually have the beginnings of different kinds of tissues and things. And so, think about your local earthworm. Now, they actually can carry out both sexual and asexual reproduction. We have flatworms, flukes, roundworms. They generally are not going to be deadly pathogens. They are often going to be knocking you back pretty good. So let's get into them and see what we got. So we're going to start out with the protozoan diseases. The protozoans, as we were just mentioning, are single cell, or they are very simple multicell. They can be, in the case of pathogenic protozoans, they can be molar or non-molar. In the case of pathogenic guys, they are distinctly heterotrophic. You don't have to worry about your blue-green algae. Just put that in your mind. Okay, you worry about them? No. They might be free-living, and if so, they're going to actually get into you by ingestion, by jabbing your skin, and you go swimming in contaminated water. That'd be a great way to do it. They can also be parasitic, and in this case, they are going to have a series of hosts that we'll look at here in a moment. So you can have a variety of diseases or disease pathology, either through intoxication, that is, they are producing toxins, or they actually can begin damaging tissues and things, and they are sucking nutrients out of you, but you can have a variety of different kinds of damages from these guys. All right, so here are a couple of different protozoan classes and some of the parasite types we see. Giardia is the classic backpacker's diarrhea. Most lakes and streams are now contaminated with Giardia. The good news is, if you're on a backpacking trip, you're not going to start having effects from Giardia for about a week and a half, 2 weeks. So hopefully your trip isn't that long. And by the time you get back to civilization, you're going to start going, wow, I'm not feeling so good down here in my guts. There are antiparasitics that will get rid of it fairly easily. Trypanosomes, Chagas disease, which sounds pretty damn nasty. These are another class of parasites. Let's see, we've got amoeba, and amoebae can cause a lot of general sort of enteric or lower GI difficulties. There are some ciliates, and then there are a range of different kinds of protists that are known as the apicoplexans. These are things like malaria, in that they actually can get inside a cell. And so you have, this is a monocyte, and then here is the plasmodium inside of it. And so they actually will stretch it out. It looks a little bit like a spore inside of a cell. They change the cell shape size. All right, so just to start with, here is a skin disease. It's actually a fairly significant issue in Africa. A disease known as leishmaniasis, or leishmania. And the leishmaniasis is generated by this protist. In this case, we have a fly vector, the sandfly, jabbing in and injecting and maintaining and carrying this. Mostly, it's going to be cutaneous. It can get into the tissue deeper. The parasites actually are replicating within the phagocytes, and they can then spread throughout the body this way. So they have a way of, in fact, defeating part of the immune system. So your best control is insecticides. Yep, that again. So this is a little bit like different types of parasites, in that we've got multiple stages of infection and the way the disease progresses. So we have the sandfly is taking a blood meal, and from there, it's going to actually have the ability to replicate the pathogen, and then the next time it is taking a blood meal, it is dumping the parasite into the skin and then potentially into the blood. So we've got a range of stages of the actual leishmania as it comes through here. So different spots where it's multiplying. So a digestive disease, leishmania is a cutaneous disease, and that's one we're going to hit on. But there are a range of digestive diseases, and so you may have heard of or had yourself amoebic dysentery. Oh boy, this is a classic problem in water that is not being sanitized and treated properly. So it pretty much is taken up through the oral route, either through food, contaminated food, or water. The cyst is going to hatch in the GI tract, and the little organisms known as the trophozoites, they are moving through the colon mucosa. If left untreated, and you're probably somewhat immune compromised, this stuff can actually start getting into the rest of your body. The cysts are transmitted by the good old oral fecal route, as it were. And so you end up having the cysts contaminating in the poop. And then if you have less than ideal sanitation conditions, these cysts can be picked up in the water and in food. Thank you very much. It's generally not fatal, but if untreated and patients are somewhat immune compromised, it can be a problem. So it begins to actually damage the intestinal lining. Not a good thing. There you go. But this is primarily treated by good water sanitation. So either filter your water or treat it with chlorine, with iodine, things like that. It's quite interesting. Sorry, in fact, our next guy is another digestive disease. And number 2, giardiasis, caused by Giardia intestinalis, Giardia lamblia. These are, again, little single cell, are they? Yeah. Protozoans. And this guy here has got a pretty serious infection where they are that many lining the small intestine. You're going to know that. Very often, people will have a chronic sort of subacute condition in which they've got Giardia, they're pooping it out, and transmitting it. So back in the 70s or so, the early 80s, as backpacking in the wilderness, particularly in places like California, let's see, Idaho, up in Minnesota and Michigan a bit, the water becomes contaminated. So as more people are out in the backcountry, it ends up becoming a problem. So prior to, like 82 or so, you could go on a camping trip and drink water out of a mountain stream, refreshing water, running right by your babbling brook there, just dip your cup in, and no cause for alarm, it was going to be safe. As more people are getting into the backcountry, it becomes contaminated. The little creatures then pick it up and they maintain it. And by the time you're in the early 80s, all of a sudden you're beginning to see articles in the Audubon Society and the Sierra magazine saying that this is probably not the time to be drinking untreated water anymore. That time has passed. And so now you have to use chlorine tablets or iodine tablets or begin filtering. And that's kind of the way things are now. There's a whole gigantic industry in water filtration where you've got a porous filter of some kind, like a fritted ceramic filter, because these guys happily are fairly large. They're not as small as the bacteria. So it's not a huge amount of filtration to remove them. Now, of course, you can't remove the viruses, so don't even try. But you can remove these organisms with filters. But one of the things you have to keep in mind, and it's like doing sterile procedure, is that every part of the system has to be sterilized. And so often you'll have a pump that has a tube that then screws onto an Nalgene bottle, and you start pumping water in. Well, what you got to do is, if you're going to really do this, is you got to begin generating some clean water and begin washing the rim of that bottle. You then have to dump the bottle out a bit, make sure that this part that's going into the bottle is staying clean and not touching contaminated water. And it's very much like doing sterile transfer procedures, that you really can't touch anything. You have to make sure that the clean side is staying absolutely clean. Otherwise, these guys will get into you and begin colonizing your small intestine. As I say, that guy is in pretty bad shape. It's a fairly simple kind of life cycle. There really are no intermediate hosts, meaning that you poop it in the water, it hangs in the water, you pick it back up. Yay! So we have contaminated food, water, and this has the infective cysts. They get in, they make their way through the stomach, just as a way that they actually divide. You have the cyst that then differentiates into the trophozoite. The trophozoites are able to interact and produce fresh cysts. One guy will, in fact, begin to be cyst. You then, they end up in the small intestine, they grip into the lining, and they continue to reproduce, and then you have the trophozoites and cysts being released into the environment as poop. The trophozoites probably are not going to survive outside, but the cysts do. So symptoms: diarrhea, gas, cramps, nausea. Of course, with diarrhea, the main problem is going to be potential dehydration. It resolves in 2 to 6 weeks, yeah, but you very likely are a chronic carrier. And that's one of the problems that happens now, is that lots of people have Giardia. They had sort of a subclinical case. They never dealt with it, never treated it, and they are still potentially pooping this stuff out. Dogs can get it, and so having your dog out in the backcountry, it's another way of maintaining the supply there. Okay, here's a few other digestive infections. Cryptosporidia. Cryptosporidia are a fairly complex life cycle in that they do undergo sexual reproduction. You take them up from contaminated food, and you have the onset takes a while, and so that makes it hard to trace because you've been around a lot of different things, and it's hard to know really what it was you got into. You end up with the same kind of sort of diarrhea, nausea, cramping that we might see. You can have cholera-like, which is intensely loose diarrhea with the intensity such that you can actually undergo dangerous dehydration, particularly in people that are immune compromised. So we don't have to worry about that too much, though. This is another kind of trophozoite, the Trichomonas vaginalis. It is a fairly common STD. So we've got the protist is able to actually attach to epithelial cells. So it reproduces in the vagina and the urethra. It's fairly common. It doesn't have a lot of real severe symptoms. It is potentially an indicator because you might have other more serious STDs. It does enhance some of the other more serious STDs and things as well, probably by just irritating the linings and things. So now, we've gone from the skin to the gut. Let's get into the blood and nervous system for just a moment. We got malaria, which is a very deadly infectious disease. Greater than 200 million infections and 1 million deaths a year. I mean, this is still happening. And it's usually the infants and the kids that get this that will actually end up dying. This is one of these guys that is a bit of a complex set of steps. It is mosquito-borne. Darn mosquitoes, once again. And it is specific to specific strains of mosquitoes and specific genera. So the Anopheles mosquito, which is found primarily in the tropics, the subtropics, and that's why we don't have much malaria in central Illinois, is this mosquito doesn't have the ability to live up here. There are a variety of organisms that can cause malaria. They're all of the genus Plasmodium. And some are a little bit more problematic than others. One of the things that is a standard part of malaria is that you end up having a period of fever and then it abates. And stress and a variety of things will kind of bring a malarial attack on. And so this is something that, in the tropics, as they were being colonized, very often you hear of the soldiers, the colonists, but end up with malaria, and every once in a while they get laid out with a bout of fever and then recover from it and continue on. So it is a problem when you're really young, immune compromised. It is something you can live with otherwise, though. So malaria has a fairly complex life cycle. And it ends up making its way through a mosquito. The mosquito injects the sporozoites that then are going to actually begin to mature into the more infectious parts, the trophozoite. So it gets into the liver cell, and it then ruptures, and then from there gets into the blood. And within the red blood cells, it goes through a maturation cycle that then ruptures, and you generate material that can be picked back up by the next round of biting mosquito. Within the mosquito, it's also going through a whole series of different kinds of reproductive states here. And so it ends up actually carrying out a sexual cycle within the mosquitoes and then getting back in an infection. And so pretty much the treatment is, there's quinine drugs that can treat it, but mosquito control is the very best thing you can do. So you end up having a recurring fever, and this is actually partly due to a red blood cell lysis that is somewhat synchronized. It just will occur. That comes with the sort of classic symptoms of malaria, of a fever, shivering, joint pain. The patient will be anemic because there is hemolysis. You end up having bloody urine because of the hemoglobin in the urine. And this can cause a range of different kinds of problems. This is the more common form, and it can be chronic. Severe, you can have a number of issues here, specifically from falciparum. The red blood cells are no longer operating properly. They can get stuck in places, and we can end up with a range of difficulties. Enlarged spleen and liver is one of the early signs of it, but then you can lead to a variety of different kinds of neurological things. Cerebral ischemia, that's going to be bad news. You have enough of the hemoglobin in the urine that it can generate renal failure. If left untreated, it is a reasonably lethal kinds of disease here. So we've got then the distribution, in that the possibility of malaria is around. In the southern states, up where we are, probably not as much, and mosquito abatement becomes the real issue. And so if you've ever, in all cities have a mosquito abatement board, and this is part of good public health, and that trying to keep open water, standing water, from accumulating, things like that, to limit mosquitoes is the way you begin to actually solve this problem. So, as we say, we got prevention, primarily kill the mosquitoes. Insecticide resistance becomes a problem. Additionally, environmental contamination is a problem. Blocking or dumping standing water is a good way to do this. The vaccines haven't worked very well. This is another one of those examples of the host-parasite relationship constantly changing. One of the ways that the immune system works is that you can sort of program it by vaccination to recognize a set of proteins. Malarial parasites can alternate the proteins on their coat such that the immune system can't get a good fix, and so consequently it can escape. A variety of drugs are reasonably effective. Over time, there is resistance occurring, and so we end up having chloroquine resistant malaria, which is a fairly significant issue because you then end up with malaria that is not treatable by standard pharmacology. All right, we're going to stop here and pick up on a few more diseases. Sleeping sickness, the trypanosomes, the tsetse fly, at least something we don't have to worry about here in the U.S.